monitored. There are all these protocols. And seclusion is used very, very sparingly. Okay, so it was highly disturbing to see that so many people were describing that this was their experience or that they witnessed this. And so that, combined with the fact that in formal facilities this would only happen if somebody was a serious present moment risk to themselves or others, danger to self or others, okay? And what these folks were describing was, oh yeah, well, if not just is it if something, if somebody aggresses toward staff or others, but if they threatened, if they broke rules, if they said something disrespectful, if they cursed, if they made a face, that kind of stuff, that's just straight behavior modification gone terribly awry. Okay, that's not consistent with seclusion and restraint practices. And there is a body of literature on the trauma that folks have experienced when in licensed facilities seclusion and restraint practices are carried out inappropriately. And so you can imagine that this is, this would be so as well. So here's a description from one of the respondents. They had a room with tile flooring where the kids went at 6 a.m. till 10 p.m., where each hour you would rotate positions. 1 hour you were lying on your stomach with your chin on the ground. The next position was standing on your knees for an hour. And the next one was standing for an hour with your nose to the wall. Okay? This was a picture that somebody actually took and got back out of one of the facilities. And again, this was in striking contrast to the Geneva Convention standards and other, Mm-hmm. Right. Right. So you can imagine if these are practices that are being carried out by folks who have absolutely no training, right? Absolutely no training or expertise. This is another quote. When participants were being restrained, they were in fact being tortured. They would be forced face down on the hard tile floor by 3 to 6 staff members. One staff would hold your legs down, which usually meant they spent their time grinding your ankles into the floor. 1 or 2 other staff held your arms out at your sides, held in the same way the ankles were. The last staff would keep his knee in your back as he pulled up on 1 or both arms behind your back to the point where you could literally touch your ear with the opposite hand from behind your back. Okay, this is, again, just, absolutely in violation of all sorts of standards of human rights. And when this respondent describes it as torture, if you were to look at descriptions of what would count as torture, this is not an exaggeration in description. Here's one that says they would duct tape your hands behind your back and then your legs together and then wrap you in a blanket like a burrito and duct tape that tighter so that you couldn't move or get out. And sometimes it would be so tight that kids would be screaming that they couldn't breathe and really start panicking, and they made students do this to other students. Okay, so again, if we think about trauma and the dynamics of abuse, and when somebody's asked to abuse another, right, or you get it, that's pretty disturbing stuff. And isolation, again, this kind of isolation is not at all what you would ever see in any kind of therapeutic setting, and even in prison settings. You wouldn't expect to see this, right? Isolation where you didn't see the sun or other people for weeks at a time. You're given even unrealistic exercise expectations. You were more easily restrained, given less time to shower, forced to lay on your face all day unless exercising for 16 hours each day. Now, if this were just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 accounts in, 400 and some odd accounts, we might say, okay, well, this sounds anecdotal and maybe there's some exaggerations. But these are consistent reports, okay? These are consistent with the ratings, the scale ratings that people were providing. And so it really did become apparent that there was a pattern that was not just a few isolated incidents being described. And so the kinds of treatment that people were describing, and again, these are the, of the entire sample, if you were to look at just the group of respondents for these items, it would, the percentages would be higher, but these are not just a few people describing forced labor and scare tactics and the various kinds of treatment that you see listed here. And in fact, these are in the Department of Defense, not the CIA, since we've had these reports this last week or two, right? Not there, but in the Department of Defense, in the kinds of settings that prisoners of war and detainees have been held in, Guantanamo and elsewhere. These would be absolute violations of human rights, and yet they're happening to American teens.
In your survey, did you ask what year they were in these programs?
Yes.
I'm wondering if this is, how far back this was, or if it was already recent.
There were several folks who described programs like in the 70s. There were some programs, there was one called Straight. There were several that were sort of this, they grew out of a drug substance abuse kind of model that was an alternative to best practice substance abuse treatment at the time. But the majority of these are folks who in the last 10 years have been in these facilities. And the majority of the facilities that were described are still in operation today. So again, this is sort of the ISO box was often described. It would be an isolation box, extreme heat, deprived of meals as a punishment, using stress positions, requiring folks to do the work of the facility, and it was sort of a breaking of the spirit. And 43% did report that they were often, or sometimes, it was a scale, a 1 to 5 scale, so sort of often, or maybe 4, I can't remember how many points, but anyway, some evidence of feeling that they had been abused by the staff in the facility. So as a few examples of the kind of abuse that youth described, peers, aggressing toward peers, I think some of these quotes, they described actually, because they're often in more remote places, that the physical abuse would happen away from the campus, and then they would come back. And so I think it increased people described a fearfulness about what was going on. And then, in addition, they described substandard education and mental health care at these facilities. People described being way behind in their high school academic achievement by the time that they were returning home. The curriculum not being substantive, and that the teachers weren't required necessarily in many of the programs to have formal training. And the therapy, as a child psychologist, I was really disturbed by some of the accounts about therapy that really, again, really violate sort of the do no harm in therapy, confidentiality just sort of not even being a concept, and group therapy being sort of these peer pressure kinds of interventions. So as I said at the end, we asked, well, what was your experience of it? And I have to say that some people would write things like, after they just described paragraph upon paragraph of the experience, like, are you kidding me? Like, you haven't figured that out yet? Of course it was terrible. But one of the things was to list a bunch of different feeling states, and to ask people to rate sort of how much they experienced each of these feelings while attending the program. And it was just so dramatic in the descriptions that those that you would expect would be part of any kind of a therapeutic, restorative environment were not present, and those that you would hope are ameliorated through participation in any kind of a program or intervention were actually very much present. So we embedded in this survey the trauma